Hello, everybody. I'm Irina Pert. I'm an associate professor at the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Tartu. And this is our seminar in the series Understanding Sobornost that that has been taking place in the last few months. This series is a part of a research project called Orthodoxy as Solidarity, conciliar and popular Orthodoxy in Estonia and the Baltic provinces in the late imperial and 20th century. So we have theologians and historians working on this project, and the project has been financed by Estonian Research Council. So I would like to give the floor to co-host Andrei Shishkov, who will introduce our speaker today. Andrei, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irina. I am very glad to introduce Vera Shevzov, professor of religion, Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies at Smith College, Massachusetts, United States, and an editor of the Journal of the Orthodox Christian Studies. She teaches a wide array of courses in Christian studies and regularly participates in team-taught courses on world religions, women and religion, and approaches to study of religion. Her book, Russian Orthodoxy on the Eve of Revolution, was awarded the Frank and Elizabeth Brewer Prize of American Society of Church History. Our current seminar is based on the research which made for the collective volume Law and the Christian Tradition in Modern Russia, edited by one of our permanent participants of the Understanding Sobornost seminar series, Paul Valier. Where Vera will speak about Sobornost and the discourse of rights in the Orthodox Church in revolutionary Russia, 1905 and to 1918. Please, Vera, floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I have, as you know, I've wanted to participate in these webinars and the discussions. I spent all last week listening to most of them, actually, so I probably remember them more than you do, since you listened to them for 2 years, and now this is all fresh in my mind and I want to speak to everybody at once. And I have so many questions about to the speakers who've come before. And it definitely is a very, very, very timely project. And I don't think actually that, Irina, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there is such an intellectual sort of history of the sort of the idea of Sobornost, as far as I know, in terms of evolution and just its different mutations. So I think this is an incredibly rich project, and I'm not even sure you'll be able to fit it into one volume, but you can ask Father Andrew about how to do that. So, I also wanted to just as a caveat say that this is a topic with which I began my academic journey many, many decades ago. It was one that was sort of introduced to me by Father John Meyendorff. He had recommended during my studies that I focus on Russia's pre-revolutionary theological journals, that they are an incredibly rich source, very little, let's put it this way, understudied. They still are. And it was there that I came into contact with this entire of evolution and the different understandings of Sobornost, not only the 19th century, but then as we get into the 20th century. So here I am, decades later, still interested in this topic. So I am focusing on this issue of Sobornost and the discourse of rights in Russia's Orthodox Church, precisely during the revolutionary period of 1906 to 1918. This essay is part of a larger project that I'm working on for the Fordham University's Orthodox Christian Studies Center's multi-year project on orthodoxy and human rights. So what I'm going to do today is just start with a little bit of historical context. I don't know where you are in your seminar in terms of the students. I don't know what you've covered, so please forgive me if I'm just being redundant, and you can somehow let me know they know all this and just cut me off. That's fine. But I would just like to offer a little bit of historical context and then maybe focus on a case study of an of an episode in the Sobor that came up to show precisely how this rights discourse began to, well, not began, but was present and influenced these reform efforts in the institutional church in this critical historical period. So between 1906 and 1918, the Orthodox Church in Russia, both as an institution and as a body of believers, faced this massive, unprecedented project of reconceptualizing itself as a community and restructuring its internal principles of governance and institutional administrative order. Now, what's interesting is that this project began and ended in the midst, well, began and was cut off, I should say, in the midst of political revolutions. Although, as Paul, I listened to your webinar, and of course you noted very well, this has a long prehistory, so it's not that these issues just arose at this time period. Nevertheless, the early 20th century project to overhaul the internal governance of church life from the parish all the way up to the highest levels of administration stood apart from those more intellectual debates of the 19th century. External circumstances, in this case, rapid revolutionary political social changes, exposed what at the time, actually, it was the council, the prime minister or the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Sergei Vita, described in his well-known memorandum to the emperor that the church, these external circumstances have exposed the heavy shackles impeding the inner life of the Orthodox Church. And if the Orthodox Church was going to meet the challenges of a rapidly changing society and culture, it needed to be unshackled from the state. And given the opportunity to restore, and this is a term that Vita himself actually used in his state memorandum, to restore the principle of Sobornost. So the church should restore the principle of Sobornost in its internal governance. So this term was actually being used in state documents when they were talking about the church. So for purposes of our discussion, we can identify three distinct phases in Orthodox discourse about church reform, Sobornost, and rights. The first was the discussion of church reforms that took place still under an existing monarchy, and that's important to point out. A rising political liberation movement consisting of, quote, a kind of war of coalition of diverse groups, monarchists, Republicans, liberals, and socialists, all moving against autocracy, and the widespread uprisings and urban strikes resulted in a series of imperial decrees in 1905 that granted basic civil rights in Russia that were informed by the principles of inviolability of the person, freedom of conscience, speech, assembly, association, as well as broad religious toleration. So these reforms, as the constitutional Democrat Paul Milyukov referred to as the first stone of Russia's constitution, had direct impact on orthodoxy. Until 1905, conversion from Orthodox Christianity, as most of you probably know, was prohibited by law. So that really posed challenges to the very idea of the church as a body of if you're going to talk about who belongs to the church, if this is all determined by state ascriptions, there are many problems associated with that. So now, after 1905, those still baptized at birth, Russia's citizens after a particular age could officially convert to another religion. And this new law thrust the institutional church, which had this, technically this enjoyed a favored legal status, it thrust it into this uncharted territory of the marketplace of religious ideas, because now people could choose to leave. Moreover, the new laws also highlighted the problems that centuries of state ascription of the Russian people to Orthodoxy from birth had caused with respect to defining church. And I sort of alluded to that already. So such ascription made it virtually impossible to distinguish between self-identified committed Orthodox believers, non-Orthodox believers, non-confessional believers, agnostics, atheists, and the indifferent. I mean, and yet they're all named Orthodox just by birth. So as a result, this is why at this time you have this discussion among, when you're talking about church reforms, that some saw the church in Russia, quote, more as a mob than as a community. So the series of new laws in 1905 was established. This is an important point. They also established for the first time a state elected assembly, the Duma. But because of the way power structures were organized in the state, the legislative issues that were included in the Duma's sort of sphere of interest included issues to do with the institutional church. So this had profound legal implications for Orthodoxy, because an elected body officials to the Duma, who in theory may not have among them any Orthodox believers, in theory, could have the power to legislate matters which could impact the internal life of the church. So this, again, this new arrangement of state governance permanently shifted the relationship between monarchy and institutional church, the institutional church in Russia, which basically marked the undoing of what was called at that time by one member of I think it was a clergy member note, it was the sacred order of things since Byzantine times. So these new kind of democratic introductions into the political sphere changed the relationship between church and state. 1905 also marked the establishment of the first legal parties in Russia. Okay, so public discourse became suddenly saturated with terms such as rights, equality, liberty, democracy, all of which carried often competing arrays of nuances, meanings, and caveats depending on the source, the context, and its reception. So contrary to frequent stereotypes, Russia's Orthodox believers, including clergy, theological academy and university professors, members of the religious intelligentsia, and lay Orthodox men and women from diverse social and educational backgrounds were not shielded from or deaf to the hopes and the demands that this rhetoric cultivated. Okay, so this became sort of part of one's way of looking at the way life should be structured. So as an example of a professor of canon law at Moscow Theological Academy, Vasily Mishkin, who was the author of Political Parties and Their Ideas from the Point of View of Social Politics and Constitutional Law, his series of editorials in the journal Theological Herald, or Bogoslovsky Vestnik from Moscow Theological Academy, is an example of this kind of engagement in this new, in this sort of open conversation about the plight of clergy and laity, energized by the social and political climate of the time. And so Mishkin tried to offer some kind of guidance in this political landscape to those clergy who were basically inspired by what they saw as the elementary truth that Christ recognized the rights of humans to well-being, okay? And that fundamental truth that Christ recognized these rights of humans to well-being was a call to clergy to struggle against poverty and oppression in all forms. So it was a social kind of mission. So while not encouraging clergy to take a particular stance in terms of a party, he advised them to take a middle path, right? This middle path between the conservative parties, who Mushkin said, for whom orthodoxy serves only as a cloak for laissez-faireism, and the radical parties, on the other hand, whose utopian ideals are presented with an aura of great humanism, yet conceal their rejection of religion and morality. And this will become important as the revolutionary period evolves. Given this environment, in 1906, with the encouragement of the Prime Minister, Sergei Vita, Emperor Nicholas II granted permission for the convening of this pre-Sobor commission. This was an exclusive meeting in the sense that it was appointed, even though it included not only bishops, but also clergy and lay academic theologians, church historians, and canonists, a few university professors, but still it was appointed. It was an intellectual kind of body, and it met for 9 months to draft proposals for institutional reforms to be addressed at a future council. So that's phase one. Second phase came in efforts to overhaul the church 12 years later, in August of 1917. So a lot happened since 1905 to 1917, but another major series of political and revolutionary upheavals, namely at this point, the abdication of Nicholas II in the midst of the bloody World War, and the establishment of a provisional government, placed the church yet in a new situation. So in the span of days, the Orthodox Church and monarchy became untethered. That was it. And reflecting this, often students, not only students, but often people are surprised that the church actually, members of the Holy Synod at the time issued no public call for support of the monarchy as a form of government. There had been a deep disenchantment with the autocratic regime by many members of the church establishment. But in any case, in light of this establishment of a new state order, and therefore changes in Russia's legislation regarding church and state, the provisional government encouraged members of the synod to convene a council to establish and to come up with its form of institutional governance that reflected their new independent self-governing legal status. Okay, so during the late spring of 1917, in anticipation of this council, we had sort of the council that preceded the council. I know that was mentioned in a couple of the webinars you've had before, but it was highly significant. It was an all-Russia assembly of clergy and laity that met in Moscow with over 1,200 participants. And I think that's very important. And it was unique because of its lack of episcopal oversight. The assembly voiced support for the downfall of the Tsarist regime, and honored those who had selflessly suffered and died in the struggle for the rights of the people during the February 1917 uprising. So the sort of the discourse in that meeting really did imagine a democratic Russia in the future, in which the church's independence from the state would be guaranteed by law, as it would be for all of Russia's confessions. At the same time, and this is what prevails throughout, throughout this 1917-1918 period, there was a difficulty of grasping the realities of what full separation of church and state actually meant. So there was this weird kind of they wanted the church, members of the Orthodox community wanted full independence, and yet the benefits sometimes that come with being, the majority religion. So you couldn't have it both ways. But in any case, given the uncertainties regarding the future system of state governance, once the council met in August of 1917, it was clear those first 2 months, there was this, repeated sense of standing before the totally unknown. This was completely uncharted territory. The councils, and what's really important to understand is that the council, governed by this sense of Sobornost as a guiding principle, along with canonicity, of course, but Sobornost was really the principle that guided all of the debates. Nevertheless, all of this took place on the backdrop of two competing centers of power, each of which had their own specific genealogies, rhetoric, and ethos of human and civil rights. And I think this is very important, precisely because these, insofar as the ethos of human and civil rights address or its relationship to religion and the approach and their sort of attitude toward religion. So the first political sort of center of political power was the self-appointed provisional government, a coalition of moderate socialists and constitutional Democrats, which to govern sort of was going to govern until this democratically elected constituent assembly decided on Russia's new new system of governance. So it was not at all ideologically inimical toward religion or the Orthodox state or the Orthodox Church, but this diverse group of liberal professionals, they were very much pro-establishment of civil liberties, including full freedom of religion and the introduction of a non-confessional legal category. So they basically did away with confessional identity as the primary form of identity in the state. So that was very important. Concurrently, the Church Council also had to deal with a second parallel center of power that came to the fore during the Tsar's abdication. After the Tsar's abdication, namely the spontaneously formed Marxist-oriented Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Socialist Deputies. And this becomes extraordinarily also important, as we will see. The Soviets' fluid membership was a sort of a group of radical socialist parties whose human and civil rights views were informed by their European Marxist counterparts, yet processed through, of course, the lens of Russia's historical reality. So they too had a discourse of liberties and rights, just as did the constitutional Democrats, but based on an entirely different premise. So calling for economic equality, the leveling of classes, nationalization of property, social justice, universal education, women's rights, universal suffrage. They were also united, these radical parties, in condoning the use of violence and terror to achieve this equality and the social rights and justice, and had a virulent disdain for the liberal provisional government and its representatives, who of course were, dismissed as bourgeois and oppressive capitalists. So this is very important to understand in Russia's history, that since the 19th century, you really did have these two sort of forms or schools of human rights discourse, I would say, in Russia. One was the European liberal kind of democratic, the other was the Marxist inspired discourse. And the liberal one, the Marxists and the more radical ones, tended to use the term in a very dismiss it very negatively. So this is why Russia's liberals actually didn't really like to use the term as a self-identifier. Because they felt this awareness that they were being, touted as these oppressive capitalists and so forth. So in any case, the Petrograd Soviet was openly hostile because of their fundamentally historical materialist approach to human rights and to all, basically to everything. And so it was hostile to all religion, and not only to the Orthodox Church. I mean, religion in general is a human phenomenon. So at least for the Bolsheviks at the time, their totalitarian utopian project involved a view of progress and human development that basically justified, and as you all know, eradicating the human experience and sensibilities that constituted believers' sacred worldviews. So that was basically the church at that time. In those first 2 months of the council, was trying to navigate between these two different centers of power, and to drive a course and its sort of future views of what the church should be, balancing these two different groups. Now, the third revolutionary shift, in which deliberations concerning church reforms took place, happened in October, only 2 months into the council, when the Bolsheviks, with the Bolshevik seizure of basically the Bolshevik coup, right, and the dissolution of the provisional government. So that was that took place during the 30th session of the council. Okay, so by the 31st session already, it happened over a weekend, the mood and the focus and the pace of the council sessions notably switched, changed course, and gradually took on a different tenor. Numerous delegates sounded notes of urgency. There was this sense that the council's days were undoubtedly numbered, and the prioritization of key issues. This is something that sort of switched as the new regime came more established, and they saw how things were playing out. So the atmosphere for the next 11 months was well captured in the words of one Petrograd priest. This is one of my favorite quotes, where he said, "Overwhelmed with the pace with which deliberations about the election of a patriarch were taking place, this unusual pace reminds me of the speed with which one sews a shroud for a deceased person rather than the clothing for a living one." So in other words, that everything was being done so rapidly, and that the careful deliberations that had informed these discussions about the best way to organize the church so Sobornost can be facilitated, that this was now somehow being sort of rattled. And it was really in January 1918, the Bolshevik regime issued its decree of separation and church and state and school and church. And the council's closed reading of that text basically, they basically saw that it was now a legalization of open persecution against all religions, Christians and non-Christians alike, and the Orthodox Church in particular, because of its former state affiliation. So in any case, whereas in the beginning months, those first 2 months of the council, you would have 350 or 450 delegates routinely present and voting. By January 22nd, by January 1918, following this issue of this decree and the increasing violence, you would have, 120, 135, and this was not a quorum. And so basically Patriarch Tikhon at the time said they would have to proceed and sort of forget the quorum, and just, who's ever there, they have to just continue in order to get things done. Okay, so basically the council's final session, held in September of 1918, came after the Bolsheviks, several days after the Bolshevik issue of their strategic decree on the Red Terror, and it aimed at curbing, obviously, any kind of resistance during the bloody Civil War. So the council's delegates, as everyone knows, basically the council never ended. They did not disband, they paused. So the point is the council remained basically open to future continuation, that they would anticipate the next session at a future date. So basically, if you see the picture, what began in 1906 as a theologically, historically, canonically, and pastorally informed discussion of church reforms in a quite dignified way, under a still existing monarchy, with thoughts at best perhaps of a constitutional monarchy taking place, moved a decade later into a mode of what they called church building, церковное строительство, under the mandate to produce a legal draft of the church's new institutional organization in anticipation of a newly elected democratic or constitutional state system. And then only after 2 months of that, the character reforms took another turn with the Bolshevik coup, and you had an entirely new situation. So throughout these revolutionary years, so basically church building efforts then transformed to church survival, and what its Sobornost and its its attempts to what did it mean in that circumstance. So throughout these revolutionary years, members of both the Pre-Conciliar Commission and later the All Russia Council remained committed to this stand of Sobornost as the guide to their deliberation and decisions. At the same time, the rights discourse that surrounded in society, that was, permeated society, also found its way and informed the ecclesial thinking on many levels. And this is what I'm really looking at in my current project. I'm sort of just because I'm sick, I had to set this up. I sort of felt I had, because I don't really know the background with which everyone has here. So I needed to sort of set up historically. So basically, before I get to maybe a case study or just some of the issues that came up, how much time do I have, Irina?
Well, I think you just started. So
I'll talk for like 10 more minutes and then give it over to you. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, fine.
Okay, so so before offering a couple of examples of this rights discourse and how it was integral and became involved in the understandings of Sobornost, I found it very interesting, and I actually reading these Diania, it can become addictive, but it's also very, it's a lot of volumes to go through carefully if you're looking for something. In any case, I noticed when over this past year or two of reading these Diania carefully of the Sobor, the Council of 1905 to 1906, that the term sensibility or soznание, with which all the deliberations, including all those, Sobornost was present everywhere. That wasn't, that was involved everywhere. But it's interesting, Sobornost as a term was used in the 1905 to 1906 Pre-Conciliar Commission. That was a term of debate and constant reflection and argument in a way it was not during 1917. That term actually was not brought up very much in terms of debate. It was almost as if there was some kind of understanding. What was more now debated was precisely the rights with which Sobornost was associated and what that meant. And I'll discuss that in a minute. But in any case, that these the different types of soznania, which with which members of the Council of 1917 to 1918 associated the notion of Sobornost and their efforts to structure church governance and to facilitate its realization. So in different contexts, and I'll just name the ones that were the most common that came up when they were discussing reforms and subordinates and so forth. You had Vera Shevzov. Does everyone here know Russian? Irina?
There are people who don't know Russian.
Oh, so Vera Shevzov, sort of faith, a sensibility of faith sort of consciousness, religious sensibilities, Orthodox Christian sensibilities, Christian sensibilities, church, ecclesial sensibility, ecclesial religious sensibility. Now, all of these are nuanced, and in the, given the context, they actually take on different meanings a little bit. Then you have ancient church sensibilities or consciousness, ecclesial hierarchical consciousness, ecclesial social consciousness, self-consciousness, self-awareness, pastoral consciousness or sensibilities, canonical sensibilities, legal consciousness or sensibilities, and a sensibility of legality, a sense of ecclesial pravosознание. So I don't even know how you would translate that. Pravosознание. Somebody can take a stab at that one. Then pravosознание. That's a hard one. So it's like legal consciousness. So, but you would have popular legal consciousness, illegal, ecclesial legal consciousness, state consciousness, parish consciousness or sensibilities, social sensibilities, universal sensibilities or conscious, вселенское сознание, вселенское церковное сознание, moral sensibilities, нравственное сознание, dogmatiическое сознание, so dogmatic sensibilities, liturgical sensibilities, and subordinate conciliar, but it's not conciliar. Subordinate sensibilities is something a little bit different, and they had people started talking about subordinate razum and subordinate чувства, that their subordinate feelings were being somehow offended or something. So in any case, just to see this range of sensibilities with which this discourse was associated, I think definitely sheds light on the practical issues that were involved in church reform efforts. Now, in terms of rights and that came up during deliberations and the goal to canonically ground these reforms, obviously there was a need to do this in a in a canonical legal way. They were still speaking about legal reforms also. So there were those who were specialized in canon law and in or jurists that were present. And in general, legal terminology associated with civil forms of governance, contemporary in Russia, now were used in terms of ecclesial reforms. And so you'd had terms like representation, majority vote, majority rule, consultative versus deciding voices, ratification, comparisons between ideal forms of civic governance and ideal forms of church governance. So these kinds of terminology always very often elicited debates about their how would you say, their propriety in a church context, right? I mean, and this is what I think this was discussed in several of your webinars earlier about, the discourse in an ecclesial, a church environment versus a political, can you can the same discourse be applied, the same terms, for example. They also, in terms of institutional changes, when practical matters came to establishing and to making sure that, now this is important to establish, that subordinist here was understood, well, obviously there was no one definition, but generally it was understood as a mode of relationality, okay? A sacramental mode of relationality that sort of, if it's sort of, that this was a form of that subordinist was an experience. It's an experience, and the purpose of church reforms was to establish a system or a church, a form of governance that would help facilitate that experience, and that would help to promote or help to cultivate subordinalists. Okay, it wasn't just conciliar rule. You could have councils and have absolutely no subordinates, and this was made clear time and time again. So there is this, I don't want to say mystical, but it was almost like a liturgical almost sensibility to it. And there was, I remember reading one member of the council who was, sort of jabbing at another one about their parliamentary talk, introducing all this. And he says, I just find this, you're cheapening something, basically. What he was saying, that I see this more as a liturgical activity, where here is almost as this council is more has a liturgical vein than it does just a simple parliamentary vein. So, so this term then, when you're trying to organize the church to promote these, to promote relation as subordinate, this form of relationality or type of communion, I would say, what were the rights of a patriarch, the rights of a bishop, the rights of a priest, or the rights of lay people? This became extraordinarily important precisely because of the notions of equality, and suddenly these terms, that brotherhood, that you see seeping in from the broader political environment at the time. And I think the impact of the discourse about equality on discussions concerning life of the ecclesial community were particularly important. The increasing embrace of notions of human and civil rights in Russia complicated matters of church ordering. Delegates had to face practical and pastoral challenges posed by the sensibilities generated by notions of universal and natural rights. Okay, so if all humans are born equal in dignity and rights, why did these universal principles then not apply to the organization of the church? Why were the ordering principles of church life an exception to these seemingly recognized seemingly recognized rights, God-given rights, right? And an example is women, right? Women, why weren't women included? Here you have, and the Sabor confronted this, the proposal to include women in all, in church life was raised precisely in the context of the socioeconomic circumstances that was giving unprecedented access to women's in the workforce, in the labor force, their, the basic recognition of their equality with men, and suddenly in the church they're not equal. That this suddenly you start seeing this. So what are God-given rights then, right? If democracy, liberal democracy is, as we've been hearing in recent discourse, that it is the ideal model, well, then why aren't those principles then the ones that govern church life? As if there's some kind of exceptionalism in the church. So this became a very practical issue. and defining legal and canonical foundations of these reforms also started informing the use of rights. The use of the term rights. For example, the canons of the past, which, it sort of had members confront and understand their understanding of what canons were, and really their elasticity, come to terms with their elasticity, that they were dogmatic canons, but that the rest of them were really not, they could change and they could have new canons, right? That it was not a closed, because everything, the life of the church was ever changing, and that old rules did not necessarily apply to new circumstances. So basically, that's really what I wanted to say, and then just give you one quick example, and then you can discuss this because I'm not feeling very well. A practical example of something that came up very early on in the Sobor to show you, practically speaking, what they were dealing with. So in the September session in 1917, there was a petition from 41 members of the council to include 2 members in a particular Sobor committee, one of these subcommittees in a council, right? Sort of this administrative office, and they wanted to include a member of the rural clergy and a peasant. So this petition of these 41 council members to sort of include these 2 members sort of out of order of the way things were usually done met a storm of controversy within this committee, right? So the issue was brought to the floor of the Sobor. Now, the issue was the irregularity of going back once a committee had been formed to introduce 2 new members, right? And that you couldn't really do that would go against the rules, the established rules of the Sobor, right? So this commission that was at the heart of this voted, should we include 2 new members or not? And it was 16 against including the peasant and the rural clergyman, and 14 for including them. Now, what was the basis of the request that came to the floor of the entire council of 500 or whatever people? So according to the members of this special administration, this particular subcommittee that wanted to include these 2 members sort of out of order, so to say, was based on the fact that questions arose in church life that dealt specifically with situations in rural areas, right? And that we needed representatives, so representation of rural ecclesial life, so a peasant and a rural clergyman. They also argued that as a central administrative committee within the council, this committee should include representatives of all members that were represented at the council itself, okay? The opposing view was that the administrative unit did not decide any issues in substantive issues, that they simply delegated matters, and that if a matter arose that this administrative body, this subcommittee needed to discuss, these were usually and this is I'm quoting, these were usually highly nuanced issues, and that they would be of the sort that the representative of a peasant really couldn't help. In other words, suggesting that peasants weren't educated enough or sophisticated enough to deal with these issues. So as one member said, of course, and this is all on the floor, I take notes at a department meeting and there's some I don't put down. I don't know why they put this down, but it's really horrible. So some of the members, these opposing said, yes, of course, among the peasants, there are persons of deep religious piety who are not tainted with contemporary skepticism. But for the work of this conciliar subcommittee, which demands knowledge of church canons and the necessary skills to sort things out in a logical subtlety, there won't be much for these peasants to do here. And moreover, they argued, well, if we start adding peasants, then we have to start adding representatives from everybody else. Well, another member got up and said, wait a minute, this is a very important question. This is not, we're living in an extraordinary time period, that this is a reflection of a very painful condition in our society. And this issue should not even be arising. It's inappropriate. And that I understand, he's saying that I understand the procedural positions of those who are voting against including these members, but you have to emphasize, he said, that the issue is more important than the principles of the rule, right? That procedurally speaking, yes, we shouldn't do this. However, the church doesn't always follow procedures, formal procedures, that we have such an understanding as economia. And in this case, we should proceed according to that, because our current social ills are grounded in a deep distrust of the people, and that this council will not be Sobornost and will not, be grounded in the very principles on which it is being guided if there's a deep distrust among all of us. So to extend the bonds to precisely the representatives of the majority of our believers, we need to include their representatives in these committees, subcommittees. Okay, so this became an issue, and it's quite touching that the peasant stood up and spoke, and he said that that the Sobor can amend the rules. And so we do request that the Sobor, inspired by the Holy Spirit to do the work of God, allow the 2 members to be added to the committee. Okay. He says that, we were sent here to participate. We weren't sent here just to sit on benches, somewhere in the back, and that we really feel we have something to contribute. We live in an extraordinary time, and maybe we have, we have to participate as well in order for this all to work, basically. And so the Sobor voted, and again, the vote very clearly, showed the divisions in the council on this kinds of close voting. So it was 188 declined the request and 171 supported it. And it was very painful to listen to the peasant afterwards get up and speak about the offense that this caused. So in any case, I'll just end there, and maybe you can either ask questions or whatever.
Yes, thank you so much, Vera, for such a interesting and informative lecture. Let's start our discussion, and the first question from Daniel Skarsgård.
Hi, Vera. Really interesting to hear about your work. I'm sorry you're feeling bad. I went through COVID exactly a year ago.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, really interesting stuff. I also my attention was also caught by this canon lawyer that you mentioned, Mushtzin. And I came across one term that he used was really interesting. He said the Soborno canonical principle at one point. So he actually elided the concept of canonicity with Sobornost. And to me, it's interesting that you bring up, of course, I didn't really look so much at the Sobor as I looked at the All Russian Council of Clergy and Laity, which preceded it.
Right.
But I didn't, and I suppose that's why I didn't come across this kind of social elitism that you that you cited, where, well, the peasant isn't educated enough. Mostly the controversy that I came across was this anxiety about how do we maintain the canonical legitimacy of the church as we are in the process of working out how inclusive or in what way the council should be inclusive. And so the main point there is apostolic succession. The understanding of Sobornost among a lot of the bishops was that it was among the that it was conciliarity, I suppose, among the successors of the apostles, whereas the kind of, I think, largely thanks to the Slavophile concept of Sobornost as being more general, there was the other movement of understanding Sobornost as a more inclusive principle. And so I was just wondering, did you see that kind of anxiety as a major factor in what you looked at in the Sobor, that the anxiety over whether in reconfiguring ecclesiastical governance, are we remaining true to the canonical principles of the church?
Yes, and I found that especially in the pre-conciliar, in the pre-Sobor commission, right, in 1906, that was a very main concern. And that's where you got this incredibly interesting discussions and debates over what are canons, what constitutes canonicity, the spirit versus the law of the canons, and what is the canon's purpose, right? Administrative canons, canons that were formulated for a particular time at a particular place, particular political, administrative, and in this case, imperial structures. How can they be relevant to a new social political reality, right? So this idea that you have to be flexible, right, in your and there was, this kind of definitely a spectrum of those who participated both in the council, in the pre-Sobor commission. Somehow in the council, this became less of an issue, I have to say. I think they were sort of, they had an imperative and they had to move fast. First you're dealing, they're actual, in the pre-Sobor commission, they're just thinking. Already in 1917, the provisional government gave them a mandate. You have to give us what you want as we're gonna legalize this. Okay, so they're already talking reality. And then you had the Bolshevik coup, which just threw everything upside down because, the whole notion of laws and lawlessness, none of the norms applied anymore. As Ilarion Troitsky, some of you may know Ilarion Troitsky, he was saying how the whole understanding of property, for example, in church life had been latently, not consciously, but latently based on capitalist principles, right? And now those principles don't work anymore. They're not the reality. And so what do? Right? Everything's being nationalized. So there's this idea that, that church property is national property, even though the church considers that property the people's property too. So it becomes very complicated, right? And you have basically suddenly from being, an institution that is supposedly most favored, not only are you leveled with other religions, but all of you together, all these religions together are slated for eradication. So, you're non-existent legally suddenly. So it just throws everything. So suddenly the whole thing is just to survive and to put measures into place. But the question about the canonicity, I think it's very important that the principle of and then the Chalach, Sobornosti, that they keep, canonicity, but in the sense that they are also correspond to the new needs of the times. I think that was always sort of the ringer, that there's a new reality. We have, we live in the world, and we have to keep we don't live in a bubble kind of idea. So canons they remain central, but they were not approached as dogma. They just couldn't be, right?
Well, could I just make one more comment, and then I'll be quiet? What I found, looking at particularly at the so-called revolution in the church, the diocesan revolutions, is that the parish clergy in particular were very anxious to remain canonical, to remain true to the canons, because in the process of asserting their voice in ecclesiastical governance, because they were afraid that if they departed from the canons, then they would lose their own prestige and their own authority.
What do you mean by departing from the canons? You mean like the electoral principle or something?
I mean, mostly, how do you get rid of a bishop that you don't like? That's what I mostly saw. Like in Tver, they really wanted to get rid of Chichagov, but they basically provoked him into resigning, and then he changed his mind. But they had to try to declare that, well, he resigned, so that's it. Because if they were to claim that we just want to get rid of him, then there's the question: how do you have any right to depose a successor of the apostle? And if you do so, then what right do you have to be a priest? What is to stop the people from losing their respect for you as a pastor? Anyway, that's why the canonicity. I saw that canonicity remained very important, especially in that revolutionary summer of 1917 in the diocese. But that's in my book.
No, that's interesting. But again, and I think this was also repeated in the Sobor many times, that there are certain criteria which go with an office, certain moral behavior, certain. So if a person's not suited for the job, if the person is not leading, if he's no longer a pastor, I mean, it's like there is a right? And I think, it's very interesting in terms of this, if you look at Sobornost in terms of relationality, sort of like this communal counterpart to theosis, sort of, right? That it's this kind of communal, part of the individual growth, and the notion that checks and balances become very important in relationality. They can't just, it's a corporate, it's like a communal thing. And I remember with Father Andrew's talk, I remember, because he was the first one that started this series, and I remember the discussions about what did Sobornost mean. And this was a topic that was discussed a lot, and I did find elements of where it was seen more in terms of ecclesiality, right? In terms of I didn't see Eucharistic, but I did see it in terms of prayer and sort of it was sacrament. It was a sacramental notion, right? So in terms of, if you have a bishop that's not fostering this kind of relationality, right?
Unpopular because he was seen to be appointed by Rasputin.
Right. Well,
like as in Philaret of Moscow.
Each one, right? Each, of course, each case is separate. But this was a problem. Don't forget, Dan. I mean, you know this better than I, that this whole idea that what was the problem here is that who was an Orthodox, who was a member, right? Clergy, are members of the church. When it comes to laity, who is a member? They're all baptized. You can't distinguish who's an Orthodox believer or not. And so anyone can come forward as Orthodox because technically they are, and not be Orthodox at all. Right. And this is where you had that whole anathema with page, when Tikhon anathematized, these groups. I mean, it's all, you don't know what to say because they don't believe it anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We should give an opportunity to ask questions to other participants. Crystal, please.
Thank you. I first wanted to remark that this article I read, Between Law and Theology, it really opened my eyes, because it wasn't clear to me which relation law, the canonical law, and civil law actually in Russia had. So it was very, very interesting for me to understand this field at all, and especially the relationship and the question of power and rights in the way. And so I also understand this. I understood also, as we had a seminar with Professor Papadopoulos, as he said that all the theology is politics. Then I first understood this topic so in this way. So it was really, really necessary for me, this particular article. And I had also a question, but I first wanted to ask you, so if you know, I'm living in Germany, and here the critics or the research is a bit different from your way of researching this matter. And I just wanted to ask if you maybe know this book. I put it in chat. Es gibt keinen Gott, there is no God. And this was really interesting to say, issued here for some years ago. And it's just if you want to have a German point of view to this kind of topic, then maybe it's interesting for you.
Oh, thank you.
And
thank you.
yes, and the question is, how did you come to this topic at all? To go for decades, as you mentioned, you were searching this pre-revolutionary journals. What was the reason you just got to this theme? Thank you.
Yeah, well, just in terms of my interest in the theologians and the thinkers that came out of the theological schools in Russia, because in the West, Russian religious thought is considered mostly in terms of Sergei Bulgakov and Frank and Solovyov, these Russian, very well-known Russian religious philosophers and thinkers, and in Bulgakov's case, theologians, but they weren't really trained in the theological academies, and there's a stereotype that the theological academies just produced, they didn't produce any thinkers, basically. And as a mentor of mine said, you really should immerse yourself in, because there's so much thought in there. And once you start reading those journals, I mean, it's limitless in terms of the topics that you can, and the sophistication with which they engaged Western thought at the time. We have to remember that a lot of these theological, that a lot of these thinkers, and whether they be historians or theologians or canonists, they studied in the West. and then they came back to Russia, right? So they many of them had some very at least several years of training in German universities. So that's very interesting. And then they come home and they process, you know, sort of this, you know, in Russian, their own in their Orthodox context, but ideas that they gleaned also from European intellectual thought. So that's and European theology. So that's interesting. And so it's through that I came, and Sobornost also just started, you know, it just permeated this literature.
Thank you so much. And the next question of Alison Kolosov. Please, Alison.
Yes, thank you so much, Vera, for a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. You mentioned at one particular point the notion of dignity, and the council members thinking about why, if all humans are born with dignity, then why does the kind of discourse of rights, why is it not part of church discourse, or something more or less along those lines? But you particularly spoke about the word dignity, and I'm just wondering about the whole notion of human dignity, and was that particular term used by the members of the, you know, the Pre-Conciliar Commission or the Moscow Council, and what was it a notion that kind of influenced their thinking, apart from this, I mean, this one particular, did you use that word consciously as part of the conciliar?
Well, I used it only because it was part of the sort of the broader human rights kind of language that was being used at the time, precisely because, and this is so important, because, you know, in Russia, it was the Marxist inspired notion of human rights, which, you know, Marxism definitely contributed to the history of human rights discourse. However, it also is, you know, based in historical materialism. So for religion and religious communities, it's just, you know, it's, you know, you're dealing with a notion of human rights that's based on a foundation which is presupposing your eradication. So it's very difficult. And that's the discourse of human rights that prevailed after 1917, whereas in Europe and in America, you have this sort of liberal democratic discourse of human rights, which is different, even though the same language is often used. So when you're dealing with human dignity, yes, I don't know if they use the actual term dignity, but just the care for the, you know, the point is that if these are the you know, if these are the concerns, how did that priest say it? You know, basically that, you know, the well-being, the rights to humans of well-being, right? That if this is, you know, why isn't it that the structures that would allow this kind of care and these kinds of values not be the ones governing church governance then, right? This was, I mean, this is sort of the question that arises when you're reading these kinds of debates, right? And especially the reason I bring it up is because of today's, you know, the whole social ethos document. And I was reading, I've been reading I read this document, and I always find it so interesting that, you know, the gratitude for the special democratic genius of the modern age. Well, if, you know, this is the ideal model to promote relationships among humans, and why then is this not why are we not having the democratic genius be the one that runs the church, that is followed by the church, right? So it's just a question. Why is the church an exception then? The ordering of church life.
Thank you. We have two more questions. First from Sebastian and then Irina.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very interesting and enlightening lecture. I really wanted to react more to Christel's questions, because I agree with Christel that the Germans have a different way of looking at things sometimes, but in this case, I do not agree with you, because the book that you showed is a general book for the general public about how religion works under communism, and it's generally Thomas Bremer is one of the main authors, and he also had a presentation in this webinar series, which you can also look at, which is on Serbia. But if you are interested in the German way of looking at the council, I would suggest you look at Günther Schulz. Günther Schulz, he has written two books, one on his own and one together with two other people, and about the council, and they are very, very, very detailed accounts of how the council functioned, which I find now in the presentation, in Vera's presentation. I found it very interesting how you present not in general how the council function, but what kind of how Sobornicity or Sobornost and the other word, which I don't remember now, which one you mentioned, which the sensibility.
Right. Different sensibilities involved.
Yes, and how the in Russian, I don't remember the Russian word, but okay, how that functioned in these discussions, and that's a very important point, which I feel sometimes that these German accounts are missing, but that's just a comment, and I thank you very much.
Soznania, maybe.
Soznania, da.
Soznania, right.
Yes, thank you. And Irina?
So, Vera, it was really wonderful. So thank you so much. And I have not just questions, but I'm just trying to maybe get something from you in terms of looking at how to kind of bring all these threads, into our discussion of Sobornost, because what we know from the period you're looking at, that people were using Sobornost meaning different things, and so there were this even during предсоборное присутствие, and they would operate, and Победоносцев used the Sobornost in a different sense than others, and that's why in one of our seminars, Thomas Bremer actually said maybe we should abandon the term altogether, because people mean different things by it. And we also tried to salvage it, so to say, but we also tried to do a little bit of, as you call it, intellectual history of the term, and from well, we are still scratching the surface, so to say, but looking at the Slavophiles, so what we see in the works of Samarin, who was the main kind of inventor of the term rather than Khomyakov, yes, so he would make this Sobornost tied with with the community, with the общинность, and kind of use it in the same way. So there's kind of a basis for, let's say, well, as Basil Luria would claim, for kind of a nationalist, take on Sobornost, and use it in these different. And then, like, if we look at the period which you've discussed, and so you distinguished between two discourses of rights, which is liberal and Marxist, but so one question, one kind of line I would like you to think about, what about nationalists and maybe even right wings? I mean, what was their role in these movements and Soborny process, and how did they actually try to use Sobornost in that respect, and that of course affected the division of the church as well. So, and then I think what we maybe can discuss, but I don't insist on that, but about the subject of rights and the subject of this kind of ecclesial experience. So is it an individual, is it a person, so how, or is it narod, or is it community? So I just wonder, what is the subject in all these different discourses, and is this subject different in this early 20th century period compared to the one that was before? We know that in Imperial Russia, the peasants have become subjects of rights quite late, in history, like only after 1860s, and even not then. It was still like a long process when, the Soslovia system was becoming less kind of oppressive as it used to be, like even, very well like that the rights were given not according to even the property, but it was according to these different castes, also Slovenia, these estates that people belong to. So I mean, if you see if you follow my drift, so what I'm trying to make you to kind of develop, how would we connect Sobornost with all these different trends, so to say, if it's possible at all?
Well, I don't think in the council they came up these fringe. I mean, you have to understand this was an ecclesial environment, right? So, and these were, I mean, as far as I can tell, these were really committed believers. For whom salvation and human salvation actually meant something and was primary, and it wasn't just political power. Political power, I have to say, was something that was, in fact, I have this great quote. They were really quite concerned about instituting a patriarch, precisely for the reason that you would have, that this whole vlastolюбие would take over, and you would get this, this primate who then became the center and somehow clouded over the real primate, Christ. I mean, you read some of these discussions, and they're actually quite prophetic, frankly. But what I want to say about the idea of Sobornost in the context of the council, they were very, 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 I'm talking about the council of 1917 and 18. I don't remember this being so much addressed in the pre-conciliar commission, or that this, the balance between Lichnost and the group, right? That, for example, каждая личность имеет право, right? So this was emphasized repeatedly. So каждая личность имеет право to do X, Y, and Z, to say whatever or do whatever. I mean, in terms of, church, just, protest something or whatever. Okay. But I think what the background of all of this is that not only in, revolutionary Russia, but in general, in the 19th and early 20th century, this whole understanding of the relevance of church. Once, if religion is becoming more, a matter of private spirituality, if you would, what's the purpose of the church? The church is, what is church? And this is really the ecclesiological kind of focus of Sobornost. And this idea of Sobornost, it took on a life of its own after Khomyakov and the slide. By this time, it's on its own. I mean, ideas take on a life of their own. They begin, but you can trace a genealogy, of course, but they just, they morph and take on meanings in different contexts. And in this case, I think the idea of Sobornost really revitalized the existential significance of church, right? For human salvation, and thereby making it, the communal integral to the ancient Orthodox understanding of theosis. right? So Sobornost became this almost, you know, it sort of became precisely the communal became integral to the personal, that you couldn't have one without the other, right? You can't grow into theosis without the relationality with the other. And so it was a, you know, but the individual doesn't get lost, the person, the Lichnost, right? So in that respect, in terms of these fringe groups, I don't know. I frankly think too much attention is paid to them. And I don't think that they really, I think it's really, you know, that you have this central spectrum, which is so rich and already so diverse, that once you get to these fringe groups, to have them either side to define the norm is sort of.
But I'm not talking about the fringe, like, you know, Black Hundred type of people. I'm talking about, well, for example, late Slavophiles, like who were still active in like in the time of this, you know, revolutionary period, and who were not really very like intellectual, but they were still quite active. You know, we have some of them here in the Baltic. They were active in brotherhoods. They were like doing some kind of associations on the local level, and they were writing about Sobornost, you know, and that was pan-Slavic kind of spirit. So maybe these groups that haven't come, and I think they've influenced some of the bishops as well. So there was this.
Well, I do think, again, the term Slavophile, like any ism, it's such a broad umbrella of such a diverse, you know, spectrum of thought, that it's very difficult. You know, when you say Slavophile, you almost have to speak of who in particular, right? So, yeah, I don't know what to say.
Okay.
Sorry, I stop here.
Yes, our seminar is going to its end, and maybe I will try to ask the last question that concerns me. And to make a bridge between the events more than 100 years ago and nowadays. When we look at the level of church discussions on rights at that time and now, it seems that they are much poorer today, including in the sense of understanding why church law is needed and what is it in the sense of philosophy of law. For example, discussions about human rights in the Russian church after 2008, when the official document on human rights appeared, do not raise the question of the meaning of law and the protection of the human person, or around the document on social ethics, which we discussed with Aristotle Papa Nicolaou at one of the previous seminars, or inside the pan-Orthodox preconciliar process. Can it be said that the discussion then and over 100 years ago was indeed stronger and broader than it is now, or it is an illusion and it was very local? What impact did it have on the development of church law through the Orthodox Church? And it seems to me that decline of the level of legal debate on and overall ecclesiastical legal culture somehow related to the decline of Sobornost in the Orthodox Church.
That's interesting. I think perhaps Paul can speak to this better than I, since he was the editor of that volume. But it's interesting that I do think the level of discourse was much higher and much more sophisticated. I just do. I mean, I read some of the contemporary documents, and I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's just that they're almost impressionistic sometimes, and they're not based in sort of this deep kind of knowledge that these men clearly had at this time period. In terms of Sobornost, the only, again, I'm not sure how that has to do with legal consciousness per se. The legal consciousness just came in how, in what structures, the canonical, what structures could facilitate best the goals of human salvation in terms of ecclesial relationality. That's basically what it was about. Ecclesiality, ecclesial relations among members of the body of Christ, and how to what institutional forms would best facilitate that. Okay, so that's all I can say, but maybe Paul wants to answer that.
I agree with both of you. Andre, of course, this is a huge discussion, but Andre's been doing a good job in recent years of lifting up the concern with the legal culture in the church and between the church and the world, which is one of the missing elements in contemporary rights discourse in churches, and not only the Orthodox Church. And I agree with what you just said, Vera. So I think we're on the same page. The discussion of rights and the church in Russia was deeper 100 years ago than it is now.
Oh, yes. Yes. But then again, we do have the Soviet experience, which, I mean, we do have to allow for that. I mean,
which was a wasteland for law in particular.
It just wiped. I mean, the Soviet experiment was a success. I mean, it did wipe out the memory and the knowledge base for all of that.
Thank you so much, Vera, for this very interesting, very thought-provoking lecture and discussion. And I would like to give a floor for conclusion to Irina.
Can I just maybe make a little point about our institutional context in Tartu? The University of Tartu has a very long tradition of legal education. Historically, it's been one of the centers of the, already like in the Russian Empire with very distinguished faculty of law, and it had a chair of church law that at one point, there was Krasnozhen and others representing the Orthodox Church, and also there was a civil law, which again many important people in Estonia who were actually Orthodox studied there, and like including Konstantin Pats. So and today we have very vibrant study of church and law in the legal department. Marilyn Kiviorg is one of the really leading scholars in this respect. So I think maybe we could continue this topic of looking at orthodoxy and this discourse of rights within this kind of context of church law and how it all affected, theology and the other way around. So I think there is a really, really rich field there, and I'm glad that Paul has been, dealing with this, and now Vera is also involved in this because, as you've just pointed out, there was this gap, during the Soviet period in studying this legal culture and the culture of rights consciousness, сознание.
The whole point is that if you look at that whole, and I'll end with that whole list of сознания, догматическое сознание, литургическое сознание, соборное сознание, нравственное, all these сознания that went into and were called upon during their discussions of church were erased. I mean, there really is such a thing I mean, there really is such a thing of the new Soviet person. There really was. And it's just gone, you know, for generations. And so it's only, you know, and this is why, to me, it's a little bit frustrating when people demand somehow overnight that yesterday it's gone and today, oh, of course they think this way. They think just like I do. Why?
There was one сознание, maybe that wasn't on the list, or maybe it was, which is the moral or ethical сознание, consciousness, which is a part of this list, which you've just.
Well, nravственное сознание, right, but that's interesting. Oh, and I do have to point out that at the end, the new сознание was the революционное правосознание,
Okay.
which went against everything.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Vera. I really appreciate that you made this effort to appear in on our screen and make this a very thorough presentation. So let's just thank you. So put our hands together, so to clap, and hopefully we'll be able to continue. And yes, so have a good end of semester, everybody,
Yes.
because I know it's the end of the term, and so and
I
then
hope we can meet in person soon.
we will. So bye.
Bye. Thank you.